can use, but I'm a little worried that I'm going to get feedback if I wander too much forward. We'll see how this works. Okay, so our schedule, next week, we will not have Westminster class next week, which is Palm Sunday, or the week after that, which is Easter. Then after Easter, Brad Beach will be in to start talking on a unit on peacemaking. And there's one Sunday where he's going to be gone, and I'm going to come back and do kind of a connection between maybe we'll call it dissent and disagreement, difficult conversations, because that's related to peacemaking also. And we'll see if that ties in with what Brad has to say. One other bit of housekeeping. I think Don mentioned last week, didn't George Washington free all his slaves in his will? And then I got confused in my mind about what, all this bit of information sometimes in my head gets overlapping, and I had to go back and recheck that to see what was, and he did free the slaves in his enslaved people in his will. The one point I was thinking about, which I had read and not quite got, there is evidence, it's very, very slight evidence that Washington thought about freeing all of the enslaved people on his plantation before he took over his presidency, after he got elected and as an act of president. And I think there's maybe like one document where that's suggested. We don't know if that actually comes from George Washington. It might have been Alexander Hamilton floating that idea and Washington nixing it. I don't know. But boy, there would have been a lot of pressure on, for instance, if Washington had done that, there would have been a lot of pressure on Thomas Jefferson in 1800 to have done that, and then every president after that. If you're going to be president, then you should not have, I don't know, who knows how that would have gone. Anyway, that's a little sidelight. Okay, this morning, the loyal opposition, I want us to think about America and Americans and your relationship to them. And so here's a question. How many Americans have you met face to face? Or what percentage of Americans have you met face to face? We've got 340 million Americans approximately. 1% would be 3.4 million. No, yeah, I don't think so either. And this is not clicking. Wait a minute, maybe I don't have it on. Oh, there we are. Okay, good. I think that if you've met 34,000 people face to face, which is a lot, you're down to 1/100th of 1%. Right? Not really very many. And I don't know, 34,000, unless you're a politician or something. I don't know. That seems like a lot to me. I've calculated that I maybe over the years had 3,400 students in class at Malone. And by the way, I now cannot remember so many of them. I feel so bad about that. But anyway, we live in this nation where, this is how nations in the modern world go, where we do not know all, people in our nation we've not met face to face. We do not know them. And yet, we feel this bond. We feel this tie, this patriotism. You talk about the United States, and at the Olympics you wave the flag and say USA, and people, nationalism functions in such a way that people feel this powerful bond with millions of people they have never met. And in fact, in history, the reality is that when a nation goes to war, most people will dive in, and people are willing, let's just say, in the current situation, we got a complicated sort of situation with a war. But generally, in wars, there are Americans who are willing to fight and kill and die for the nation, which is kind of like for all these millions of people they've never met before. In other words, that tie goes very, very deeply. And so We have to, but here's the problem. Since we've never met them, we have to imagine them. There's a historian who calls this, we live in imagined communities. And in the modern world, right, you have this tie, this sense that I belong to this nation. But the vast, vast majority of these people, whoever they might be, from Southern California or Idaho or Philadelphia or Arkansas or even Texas, you have to imagine who they are and what they are like. But it also means that if we feel like something is wrong, we can get very, very easily angered or scared or anxious about these other people that we also have to imagine. And, you know, we see images, we get reports. I mean, look, I have no idea who any of these people are. I just pulled pictures off the internet. I just know these are Americans of some sort, of different places, I don't even know where they're from, right? But I just know that you know, they are out there in some sort of way. But how do we know about them? You know, like, how do we know? And this is a problem like in politics. What do we know about our elected officials when they're running for office? Whoever's running for president gets a lot of press, but then there are congressmen and senators, and there's state senators and state congressmen and women, and you know, and then there's all the other people in office and justices and local levels. Sometimes it's even on a local level, it's a name, and you maybe have a better chance of knowing somebody, but that's really kind of hard. What kind of people are they? What are they like? Are they good people? What is important to them? And then there's all these millions and millions of people who vote for all these people. What are they like? And what we have to do is, what we end up doing is categorizing them in some way, right? And so what we have are all kinds of categories that we use: Democrats and Republicans and MAGA supporters and progressive and social liberals, conservatives and moderates, and we go on and on and on. I just threw down, you know, different categories that we have, and there could be more, right? I mean, you could go on and on with the type of categories that we use for people, and these categories are imagined groups within the larger imagined nation that we have. Now, I should say this, just a side note. We have to categorize. Our brains just do this. Cognitive psychologists will say that we can't make sense of the world unless we put things into categories. And so we have grass and shrubs and trees, right? We know the difference between those. And then within trees, there are maples and there are pine trees, different kinds of pine trees. There's spruce and blue spruce. Anyway, we have to put, you know, categories within categories within categories. We have to do that. And we will naturally do that. So the problem is not making categories. The problem is when we have overly simplistic categories that we think and act on, especially when it comes to people. So when you put together that we live in an imagined community, and also the long-standing Christian belief that sin does affect our thinking, it distorts our thinking, I think we run into two major problems. They're actually sort of ditches on either side of the road that we can fall into. First of all, we often start off by assuming that the people in our group, whatever the group we happen to be, we imagine that they all think like I do, like we do, and then the sin comes in because, and of course, that's what is correct and morally good and, you know, right. But since I, you know, think that way, the sin comes. I'm always right about this, and the people around me, they all think that way too. And so we are, you know, there's that tendency to say that we're always really right on top of everything. We're the ones who see clearly and morally. And then we encounter disagreement, and then we have to deal with that. And so then there is this tendency to say, well, my group is correct and this other group is incorrect. And then we assign bad motivations to other people. And this, by the way, there, one way that Americans in many ways have tried to deal with this for a long time was, well, then, so you need to be unbiased and be neutral. Well, that is impossible, number one. You can't be unbiased. Number two, you can't be unbiased and talk about a moral issue. There's a moral issue is a stand on something. But also number three, it's impossible because cognitive psychologists have shown we've got all kind of unconscious biases that we're not even aware of. Try as much as you want to be neutral and unbiased. We just have these, and that's a whole other interesting sort of thing. But theologically, I would say that's a way that sin affects our thinking. We tend to look at ourselves more highly than other people. We even do this unconsciously, and so that involves our thinking and our perception. Okay, so we have all of that. This is not a new thing. We have imagined communities and sinful thinking in the Bible. And if you think about two groups, we can name a bunch, Jews and Samaritans. Jews kind of had to imagine what Samaritans were like. And Samaritans had to imagine what Jews were like. And the problem you get into, of course, is that you end up putting them in a box, and Jews look down upon Samaritans. Samaritans were looked down upon Jews. By the way, after when we get to the book of Acts, we've got two new categories, Gentiles and Jews. And if you look, like the whole book of Romans is built on a pastoral letter, Paul to the church in Rome, where you've got Jewish Christians who really look down upon Gentile Christians, and Gentile Christians really resenting the Jewish Christians. That's really the underlying conflict that is there, even when we're in the same body. So this is part of the problem that we have in doing this. I should also mention in here that let me move on to, we'll move on to an example of where this plays out. In Luke 9 and Luke 10, there are a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the Zebedee brothers, James and John, who had gone out in Samaritan village, had rejected, did not welcome Jesus and the group as they're heading up to Jerusalem. And the Zebedee brothers says, should we call down fire upon them? And Jesus rebuked them. Okay. This is that point in time when Jesus is going to be heading to Jerusalem. The disciples and a lot of followers are going to go with him, and they're going to go through Samaria. There's a number of other things that happen. There's also a passage where it's interesting that it comes right here. You may remember this, where there are some people who say, I want to follow you, but first let me go bury my father. Okay, there's others who basically say they want to follow Jesus, but kind of on their own terms, not on Jesus' terms. And some of the, if you remember that passage, there is a situation where Jesus is sending out the 72. This is a little bit different from the Samaritan village that did not welcome them. But he takes 72 followers. He sends them out ahead. This is in Samaria. And he says, you're going to get different reactions from people. You are going like sheep among wolves, and some people will reject you. Some people will not accept you, but others will welcome you with peace. And if so, accept it and go into their home. He's saying that the Samaritans will react to this whole thing very, very differently. And then at the end of that point, he gives this little Jesus gives this little speech about woe to you, and then he names towns, Capernaum and Chorazin and so forth. It would have been, it'll be worse for you than Sodom and Gomorrah. And here's the interesting thing about this, in this setting, those are Jewish towns. Those are towns in Galilee. They're not Samaritan towns. Jesus says, you will be rejected, but he's saying sometimes it'll be Jews who reject you as fellow Jews. And then the 72 go out, and then they come back, and they're rejoicing. They're saying these amazing things have happened. I mean, and they were rejected in some places, apparently, but there are other places where they say, we're healing diseases, and the gospel's being spread. It's very, very exciting. My point here is, you got a lot of stuff going on between Jews and Samaritans in the midst of this point as Jesus is heading up to Jerusalem for, the end. For essentially is what we are doing for next Sunday, Palm Sunday, Holy Week. And it involves these Jews and the Samaritans. And at this point, you get a religious scholar who comes to Jesus. And we get the parable of the Good Samaritan. The most popular, well-known parable there is, maybe, except for the prodigal son, which is kind of misnamed, but nevertheless, the prodigal son. I mean, right? I mean, everybody knows the Good Samaritan parable, but I think the context here is really quite interesting and quite important. And the scholar, some translations say a lawyer, but not a lawyer like we have today. It was a teacher of the law, the Torah, the laws of, given in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth. Stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, testing Jesus, it's actually not a bad thing. It's actually something we should do. This was common in Jewish culture, still common today, where you question it. You say, hey, wait a minute now. I want you to clarify what you are saying. We should be willing to do this with one another, right? And I mean, on good terms, just, ask, well, wait a minute. Can you tell me this? What is this? And he asks a question. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit life? And Jesus responds to him, what is written in the law? How do you read it? He responds to the question with a question. And I read this story from Eugene Peterson. He said there was a conference where there was some situation where somebody was interviewing Elie Wiesel, who wrote Night, who had been through the Holocaust and was one of the leading Jewish proponents of Holocaust remembrance and so forth. And the interviewer said, I've noticed that you Jews oftentimes respond to a question with a question. Why do you do that? And Wiesel said, why not? Okay, so anyway. He said, and look, Jesus does this too. He answers a question with a question. How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. All right. The religious scholar is basically wanting to be sure Jesus, there have been and there were false prophets, false messiahs during this time. Is this man Jesus orthodox? Does he understand the law? Is he on, is what he says and what he does, are they on solid scriptural grounds? And we've reached a point where we said, yes, we are. Okay. But then the religious scholar goes on just a little bit more. And then, desiring to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, the interesting little phrase here is desiring to justify himself. Justify himself for what? Luke doesn't tell us. What is it that you're wanting to justify yourself about? And I think that maybe the reason Luke doesn't tell us is because this is something that's applicable to people everywhere at all times and all cultures, that there are times when we want to justify ourselves. And for some reason, something about that love your neighbor bit, something there is niggling at the religious scholar. And we don't know what it is. Here's one guess that I have that it could be. That this scholar has seen, first of all, maybe he was around when Jesus rebuked the Zebedee brothers who say these Samaritan people are blocking the kingdom of God. And maybe he was around when Jesus said, woe to these Jewish villages. And maybe he was around when the 72 came back and said, we're doing these wonderful things in Samaria. And maybe this religious scholar is saying, Jesus is soft on Samaritans. Maybe, maybe he's like, he's got one of these, touchy-feely kind of theologies that's going to, to take a group that is corrupt, that have corrupted the law. I mean, Samaritans. You know what Samaritans are like. And, for somebody who has corrupted the law and have abandoned God in his way, perhaps in his way of thinking, and are leading people astray, we can't treat them the same way we do fellow Jews, can we? I mean, we don't. It seems like Jesus is dealing with the Samaritans in a way that are saying, yeah, what you're doing, that's all okay. So maybe Jesus is straying from orthodoxy. I don't know. I don't know if that's what it is, but I think it's a possibility. And who is my neighbor? And then Jesus, now we get into the Good Samaritan. And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which I'm not going to read because you all learned it in the 3rd grade and have heard it over and over and over again ever since. That's kind of disappointing, isn't it? Because this parable is the fun part. Should I read it? Because act it out. Poof. Oh, yeah. Okay. There. I acted out that much. Yeah. I think the wonderful thing about the Bible is that it works on so many levels and can be applied to so many different situations and at different times and different places. It can fit this, and I think things can fit the situation we're talking about. And as I imagine Jesus telling this parable to this religious scholar, there's got to be a couple hundred people around. I mean, the 72 have come back. Jesus draws crowd. He is, in some sense, a celebrity. And they're in Samaria. And a good number of those people are probably Samaritans. And here's this religious scholar maybe questioning the whole Samaritan thing. And even if he didn't, you got a lot of Jews who are like, Samaritans. You know what they're like. There is one other thing, and there's a translation issue, and this I came down on my reading. Down at the very end, verse 36, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? This is the ESV, the English Standard Version, and I think, which of the 3? But it does get translated in other ways, and Eugene Peterson tipped me off to this, and I went and looked. The Young Literal Translation says, who then of these 3 seemeth to thee to have become neighbor? The ESV is, who proved to be a neighbor. Other translation says, who was a neighbor. And Eugene Peterson argues that this really is, and in Peterson's book, his transliteration, the Message, if you know the Message, he frames it as which of the 3 became a neighbor. Now, I don't know which one, I don't know what the interpretive issues are here. I have a good friend that I want to talk to that I have not talked to. He's a biblical scholar at Malone. He's great with languages. I'm going to ask, I see him, whenever I see him, I usually have a question. Hey, what about this passage? What is this in the original Hebrew, And he just pulls out his phone. He looks at the Hebrew and he says, well, this word means this and this. It's great. Everybody should have a biblical scholar for a friend. If you can do it, it's a wonderful sort of thing to, anyway, I'm going to ask him this. My guess is that the Greek can be translated in several different ways. It can mean several different things. Either was or proved to be or became a neighbor. But it is interesting because I don't think we usually think of it as who became a neighbor, and that has an interesting connotation for us. That we are to become neighbors. What? Who is what?
He was not his neighbor.
He was not his neighbor. Yes. The religious scholar, or no, sorry, in the parable, the other 2, the priest and the scholar were not the neighbor. And the Samaritan, is that what you mean? The Samaritan was not originally a neighbor. Maybe there's an even implication of that, but because the Samaritan helped him, he became a neighbor. Which is, and I don't know if all of these translations are acceptable and good, but it's worth thinking, because at least I don't. Maybe you do, but I don't think. I need to become a neighbor. I mean, this fits with our understanding of the Christian life, right? Sanctification and growth and becoming more godly. We become something. And who is my neighbor can sort of mean like, well, what about those people? We've got their box for them. What about those people? We've got our box that we put them in. Are they a neighbor? Are they a neighbor? Well, what is their stance? Where do they come from? How do I become a neighbor to them? A different sort of way of looking at it. And that has implications for how do we become a neighbor to all of these people? Especially when we have to imagine them, most of them. Do you personally know somebody who fits every one of those categories? Maybe. Wow, I'm impressed if you do. You might. I mean, you know them well enough. But anyway, we need to become neighbors to all these kinds of things, which means we will run into disagreements. All these people are not going to, we will run into, and some of these people may be supporting things that are actually just bad and that are harmful. But how do we love them? That's the challenge. And how do we do it? And then here's now the next question. How do we do it when it's not just people we meet face to face, which we'll get into, I'm planning to get into that in April when we're talking about peace building. How do we do it with people we talk to? But I want to, before we do that, I want to talk about, what about the 340 million people we will never meet? How do we become a neighbor to them? So I have some modest suggestions. I don't have any good answers to all of this. In fact, I'm hoping to finish in a good time, and you guys can tell me what you think. But here's some modest proposals. The only way we can know really about the other people in America is through the media. In fact, media, a medium, that's what the word means, right? It is this structure that is a go-between between people we've never met, and whatever that may be, television and newspapers and movies and cable news, for Pete's sake, and other sort of things. How do we consume our media? This is one thing I think we need to think about. And my thought is, one thing we might want to do is be intentional about consuming different kinds of media. Because we know there are news organizations that come from a liberal point of view, news agency or organizations that come from a conservative point of view, some that maybe do a little bit better of doing a bit of both. But maybe we should, what kind you consume. Think about, okay, I need to maybe intentionally read or watch or listen to something from the other side of the aisle. I mean, not just a person, like when you get up on cable news and you have this very complicated issue and somebody asks a question, okay, go, you got 45 seconds. How about these people? Oh, okay, go, you got 45 seconds. Then a rebuttal, 15 seconds, 15 seconds. All right, there we are, decide. When things are so more complicated than that.
The explanation you had before, he was not his neighbor until he did something. And just to say, there's people out there, they're not your neighbor, they're just people you know.
That's right. Okay, so now we're into something very, so Don, I don't know if you all heard this. He said, he pointed out, the Samaritan was not a neighbor until he did something. And Jesus says, go and do. That's exactly right. Okay. So how do we do? I guess that's the implicit question in here. And I'd say this is just a start. One thing you can do is to try to understand somebody who thinks differently from you and maybe has some different ideas that you haven't considered. And that means maybe reading something that you don't like and maybe doing it regularly. That's just one suggestion.
There's a magazine called The Week,
Yeah?
and it does. Like,
Is this?
every single story, it has world opinions, and I read it every week.
That's a good idea. I've
It
not...
makes me read stuff that I would never encounter, and that I might not agree with, but I have to think about it.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. I would for a long time I took the New York Times, and I also subscribed to the National Review to try to get both. Apple News. If you ever do Apple News, it actually has from a range of different. There's the Washington Post, which is more liberal. There's Wall Street Journal, which is more conservative. But this is the Week may have distilled it down pretty well.
Reviews there every week.
I think that's a great idea. So that's because part of the problem is that, right, we can get into kind of the echo chamber of just only thinking and viewing one particular way, and then we end up stereotyping somebody that we don't know. Related to this is, apart from the news, be intentional about taking in different stories of people who think and act different. And this can be anything from books to maybe thoughtful movies that you watch, to there's oftentimes other kinds of human interest stories, that sort of thing. Take in a diversity of stories. It would be another solution. And then this is my own sort of little pet peeve. I really dislike political advertising. And my advice is just avert your eyes whenever political ads come up. And I think that most political ads, I think, are just toxic. I apologize to those of you who have run for office and you need to advertise. That's how things work. And there are good or decent advertisements out there, but generally a lot of, especially negative advertising, are designed to set up this dichotomy. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Right? And they're not real, they're really for ammunition. Let's, whatever, fire our shots at the other person, and not for illumination. And so my thought about a lot of political advertising is it's to mobilize. By the way, political scientists have shown that advertising does not actually do much to persuade people to change their minds. But people spend a lot of on advertising because what it does is that it stokes our anger or our fear or our passions, so we're more likely just to vote for whoever we already believe we should be voting for. It sort of solidifies whatever we believe, and so it does have that impact in terms of mobilizing people to get out the vote for whatever their preconceived notion might be. And my point is, maybe there's something on the other side you should consider it to be possibly true, or maybe there's even a good candidate on the other side of the aisle. Heavens, what a strange idea. So those are just some things. Okay. Now, we can maybe find biases in this, but I want to do a little. I want to show you what's in 1932. The United States has an election, and I want to show you the difference between the United States and Germany. And there's some problems with American ads, but when you get extreme good guy, bad guy, extreme partisanship, watch what happens. Okay, so this is what's going on in the United States. FDR, the man with the heart. Vote for Hoover. Don't change now. Okay, America, play safe with Hoover. Back when we had buttons. I guess we do. Vote for FDR 32. Happy days are here again. Okay. 1932 was also an election year in Germany. This is right before Hitler takes over Germany. The Weimar Republic had been a republic for 12 years approximately before this. It was a democracy, but it was a flawed democracy, and it had some weaknesses and some things that were unhealthy about it. So let's take a look at some of their political advertisements. And look at the visual more than anything. It's in the slogan. The People's Party, against civil war and inflation. This powerful man just stomping on the people below. The Communist Party, an end to this system. Just going to rise up and smash capitalism. Social Democrats, clear the way for List 1. That was the party ticket that they would vote for. And you get, again, the strong, powerful man in the middle elbowing the Communist Party and the Nazis on both sides. The Nazi campaign poster, smash the world foe, international high finance. Bam, bam, bam. You know what's missing? Pardon? Candidates' names. It is interesting. You don't have people there. It's like this whole group of people, they need to be silenced. In essence, you're missing a loyal opposition. There's good guys and there's bad guys. You need to destroy the bad guys. Now, you have, I would say these are more likely looking upon political opponents as enemies. And what we had in the United States in 1932 was more that you were looking on political opponents as opponents. And, none of these systems are perfect, but this is unhealthy. This is unhealthy when you've got, our group has everything exactly right, and the way to deal with others is to eliminate them. And by this, the physical, the sort of visual of hitting them with force is, underlines that sort of thing as well. Yeah. I want to, before you start reading that. So the part of the election season that I like the best is when it's over. Listen, poor politicians. Really, there are a lot of good-hearted politicians out there. I've got a former student running for a state. Actually, I got a couple of former students on different political parties running for state office this fall. You've got to work within the system. But the political ads just annoy me so much in terms of how, when you get to the extremes, then you get what you had in Weimar Germany, right, where the enemy is the opponent, my political opponent, is something to be destroyed or silenced or eliminated. And so my favorite part of the election is not only when it's over, but the concession speech. We have built up this tradition in the United States of the concession speech, right? I don't know, right? On election night, when you have the votes come in and they announce this person is won, the opponent at some point will get up and make a speech to, usually, in a campaign area with all of his followers or her followers. And I want to point out some very, very good concession speeches. In fact, you tell me what you see in these speeches that are good. Let's go to 2012, Barack Obama versus John McCain. These are presidential concession speeches. And in the midst of his speech, the speeches are longer than this, but John McCain says this: Senator Obama and I have had and argued our differences, and he has prevailed. No doubt, many of those differences remain. These are difficult times for our country, and I pledge to him tonight to do all in my power to help him lead us through the many challenges we face. I urge all Americans who supported me to join me, not just congratulating him, but offering our next president our goodwill and earnest effort to find ways to come together, to find the necessary compromises to bridge our differences and help restore our prosperity, defend our security in a dangerous world, and leave our children and grandchildren a stronger, better country than we inherited. Whatever our differences, we are fellow Americans, and please believe me when I say no association has ever meant more to me than that. You see the qualities? This is the loyal opposition. Why?
In the second paragraph, wasn't that a lot from the preamble to the Constitution?
Oh, yeah. There's some hints back on that, isn't it? You know, of the, you know, we the people are doing these things for, for our posterity. You know, he talks about the children and the grandchildren, and to establish our republic. And but yeah, I think there are hints of that also. He's saying we have our differences and we will have our differences.
The whole idea of we think we can have our opposition, but together
Yes.
we won't get through this.
We have our opposition, and it's assumed that we are working together, and we will disagree, and we will continue to disagree, and we have disagreed, but we will compromise, and we're still, because there is something higher than whoever wins the election, or whatever political party it is. There's something higher than that. Yeah. Okay. 2000. Do you remember the 2000 election? Al Gore and George W. Bush, and it was tied. It was effectively a tie, right? It came down to Florida, whichever way Florida went, and, you know, it was so close, it's just a question of do you count this ballot or that ballot? Is this valid or not valid? I don't know how you'd ever decide that whole thing. And it went, you know, and it went on for, 6 or 7 weeks, and then finally went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know, these particular ballots count, and the election goes to George W. Bush. Okay. Al Gore then gives, this is a little bit longer, but I think it's worth it. Al Gore gives a concession speech in which he says the following. We almost got it. There we are. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, not under man, but under God and law. That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now, the Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome with which we ratify next Monday in the Electoral College, and tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. Now notice, there's several things here. Number one, he states the basic principle. There is a law, even references God, higher than, right, not under man, under human beings. Higher, the principle is higher than the human. And notice that he strongly disagrees with the Supreme Court decision. He says they got it wrong. But I will accept it. What?
He doesn't say for the Americans to accept it.
He says, I accept it.
Yeah, but it doesn't say.
Well, he doesn't say, but he's just urging Americans to accept it, right?
He suggests that everybody accept it, but he doesn't.
Well, he says, I will accept the decision. I still think it's wrong, but I will, this is our system, and we have to go with it. They're the ones who make this decision. I accept that they're the ones who make this decision. I just think they made the wrong decision. But, okay, here's the thing. He quit. He left. He went home. He's a great loser, Al Gore. And then President-elect Bush inherits a nation whose citizens will be ready to assist him in the conduct of his large responsibility. I personally will be at his disposal, and I call on all Americans. I particularly urge all who stood with us to unite behind our next president. This is America. Just as we fight hard when the stakes are high, we close ranks, come together when the contest is done. And while there will be time enough to debate our continuing differences, now is the time to recognize that that which unites us is greater than that which divides us. While we yet hold and do not yield our opposing beliefs, there is a higher duty than the one we owe to a political party. There it is. There's a higher duty we owe than to a political party. This is America, and we put country before party. We will stand together behind our new president. So, a little story here. Shortly after this, I think it was the next year, 2001, I met a missionary who had been a missionary in Bulgaria. And he was in Bulgaria during the election time. Of course, this is world news. What happens in America just gets spread all over the world. And during that time, when things were under dispute and before the Supreme Court had ruled, this missionary is talking to some Bulgarian friends. And he said, what they said was this. He said, look, Al Gore got more votes than George W. Bush, right? He won the popular vote. Al Gore got more votes. He's vice president of the United States. Bill Clinton is president right now. He's in charge of the military. Al Gore should just declare he's the winner, and if people don't like it, he can just take over the military because he's right. Now, I started telling this story every year in my American history class when we were talking about the foundation of the Constitution, and when I was talking about, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and that sort of thing. And the first time I told it, a few students laughed out loud, like to take over the military. Like as if that is one of the stupidest things. Like, how can these people think this way? And you know what? As I thought about it, I thought, that's a good sign. I mean, what the student needs to do is learn why somebody from Bulgaria might think differently. But the good sign is that it's absurd to you that an American president should try to take over by force and maybe not accept whatever it is. And I thought, this is my own little test. And I thought, as long as I still get students who laugh, we're in good shape. And I have to say this. They all laughed up until 2020. I could be just I haven't been able to deliver the line well enough, to get the comedian. My timing's off. Comedy is about timing, maybe that's what it is. I don't know, but I don't get the laughs. Maybe because we recognize, well, actually, maybe we could conceive. And possibly it is possible that you try to just use force to and say this election is not valid in some way or another. All right, so now now we're getting into difficult sort of territory. And I want to go to the 2024 election of Trump versus Kamala Harris. And I want to preface it by saying this, that of course what's on deep background here is on 2020 where the election is disputed. And most Americans believe that that election was largely fair. There are a good number of Americans who believe that it was stolen or it was fraudulent. And this goes to an issue of the loyal opposition in this particular way, and that is that, and I don't know where all you are coming from, but I recognize that people have differences on this, but there's a way to work this out. And one way to work it out is, first of all, who are you listening to when you believe it's one way or the other? And if you're listening to politicians, that may not be the best source. And if you're listening to your particular news that you like all the time, that may not be the best source also. And if you look at both news sources, and this is also what I tell my students, and then also you look at what happens when this goes to the courts. Because it was the courts who decided 2000. This election was a little bit different, though. It wasn't just a tie. It was a question of whether particular states there really was fraud or not. And the courts have decided over and over and over and over again, there was not fraud. And the Supreme Court will not hear challenges to this. And the Supreme Court, is largely conservative. And I would say, that's the evidence for why I say there was not widespread fraud in the 2000 election. But I also recognize there are people who believe that it was stolen, and a lot of those people, a good number, I know some people who are like this, are some of them good-hearted people, maybe people even of goodwill, but I think my guess is a lot of them are just listening to one particular news source, and they're only getting one perspective of things, and nobody has told them, well, what about the court decisions on all of this, including courts that were judges who were, Republican-appointed judges. And plus you got Republicans like Mike Pence and others who said, no, this is, was a valid election. Okay. Now, 2024, Kamala Harris loses to Donald Trump. And in the immediate aftermath, there was a movement among some Democrat supporters to say, wait a minute, something fishy is going on. And you can see this social media post. This person says, how can the total number of voters be less this year than there were in 2020 after we've had the biggest turnout than ever before? Demand a recount and an investigation. Hashtag do not concede Kamala. So there were some people in the immediate aftermath who are saying, this doesn't add up. Something is fishy. There must be a fraud because the polls show we had bigger turnout of Democrats, and yet when you're looking at the numbers don't reflect that. Now, there is a logical explanation for that, and that is at this point, which I think was election night or the day after, they hadn't counted all the write-in ballots. When you add the write-in ballots, it did put the numbers up, but not enough to flip any state toward Kamala Harris. But here's the point I want to make. Whether, to what extent you think Kamala Harris was a good candidate or not a good candidate, I will say this. She's a good loser. Because here's what she says in her concession speech. Now, I know folks are feeling and experiencing a range of emotions right now. I get it. But we must accept the results of the election. Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power. A fundamental principle of American democracy is that when we lose an election, we accept the results. Now, that's a principle. It's also a political point she's making there, right? Okay. But still, it's a principle. That principle, as much as any other, distinguishes democracy from monarchy or tyranny, and anyone who speaks the public trust must honor it. At the same time, in our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but the Constitution of the United States, and a loyalty to our conscience and to our God. There's God again. The place where we get the clearest sort of articulation of the loyal opposition, seems to me, is in concession speech, which is why I love a great loser. I really do. And we ought to praise great losers more, I think. Because it's a recognition of this. We are going to disagree. We might believe the Supreme Court was absolutely wrong, but we accept it because it was worked out in the proper system and was worked out peacefully, and we're not trying to take it by force or overthrow things. And it also involves and it requires us to look and think about other people who are different from us and deal with people we disagree with and people who might even be harmful. Now, speaking of harm, there are some people who actually believe things that would be harmful to democracy. And we have Americans that are like that. And one is called the semi-loyal opposition, and another is called the disloyal opposition. I mean, to go back in time, both the fascists and the communists were disloyal opposition in Germany. They wanted to win the election and then take over and do away with elections. They were it. The party was everything, not anyway. That exists. We're going to talk about that a bit in April. What do we do then if it's one thing to disagree with me because, I believe the Cleveland Browns should hire a new general manager, or, I really do think that Cane's is better than Chick-fil-A, on things that don't matter that much. But what about things that are actually really very, very important? That's a question. Okay, Dan. The semi-loyal opposition, and I didn't give a definition of that, but that is people who use the democratic system, but they put up with people who are breaking the law and trying to undermine the system. In other words, no, I'd say more than put up. Do I want to go into this? I'll go into this very briefly. I'll use one example. William F. Buckley, who founded the National Review, a very conservative magazine starting in the 50s, 60s, was trying to reinvigorate a conservative, intellectual, political base for the Republicans. But one thing he did not allow within the magazine were anti-Semites, people who were anti-Jewish, or John Birchers, who are just pretty extreme in their anti-communism. He said, he says, yeah, we're not going to arrest them or anything, but we don't want them in the Republican Party. We don't want to tolerate them, even if they can get more people to vote Republican, because what they believe in is going to undermine democracy. And so so what Buckley was arguing against was a semi-loyal opposition, which is like, we want to get power. Hey, these anti-Jewish racists and extremists can help us get votes, even though they would not be good for democracy. We'll let them be in. That's a semi-loyal. And then the disloyal opposition, people who want power because they want to take over and pretty much eliminate and do away with democratic situation. We'll talk about some of that in April. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts or observations?
Did Donald Trump ever issue a concession speech?
No, I know, no. Because he still says that the election was stolen, so that's a statement that he does not concede. And I see that as a real problem. And the biggest problem is actually not that he believes that or says that, but so many people also believe it because they follow them. He's their man. And so we do have a problem in this country in that you've got a large number of people who believe that our system is corrupt because the election was stolen. You've got a large group of people who believe our system is corrupt because it wasn't stolen, but there was an attempt to try to, by force, get the House of Representatives to get Congress to not verify the electoral votes. And so we got a problem, a constitutional problem one way or another that's still sort of swimming around there unresolved. And so let me say this, the loyal opposition is actually really very, very difficult to establish and to maintain and to build in, and for us even to follow. Especially on day-to-day things, which I'll get to in April, because I'm not good at this also, in having difficult conversations with people that I disagree with. But we need them. Dan? Okay.
So let me not go into Easter with this.
Oh.
We started off today saying that, and on behalf of discipline, neuropsychology, says that we, by human nature, always box or define or categorize, which are human nature.
Yeah.
And we're trying to work out of what our human nature is, and I think the ultimate goal is the theology of unity.
Mm-hmm.
Christ prayed for that we all be one, which is all dependent upon being one in spirit, in one in God. And it's almost like we're saying it's impossible.
Yeah.
It's impossible to not be biased. It's almost impossible to not make a choice. And then we talk about taking a stand, nationalism, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
There's a conundrum here.
Yeah.
That's an ongoing, and I feel like the chipmunk in the wheel.
Yeah.
And I'm running, trying to find, am I chasing my tail or am I catching up headwinds? I mean.
Yeah. That's a very good point. It is a conundrum. It is difficult. Courtney, did you want to add something to that?
Dan, I was just talking to my kids this weekend and watched this video, and
I should do this. Sorry.
And the video was talking about how our natural, flight, fight, or freeze response, and how that is very good if you run into a bear or you're in a dangerous situation, but that our brain activates that even when there's not a bear in front of us. It's just someone we don't know and we have to make conversation with them, and that makes us anxious or whatever. But I thought the video was helpful because it's remembering we maybe have these natural inclinations in our thought processes, but we need to recognize when they are not serving us. So maybe it's helpful for us generally to be able to distinguish between trees and bushes and plants that grow on the ground, but when we're in an intense political debate or something like that, to recognize this is my human neighbor, this is a brother in Christ, this is not the enemy. So to say that our brain maybe does naturally categorize, but recognize when that tendency is not serving us.
And then the question begs again, who's our neighbor and who's our enemy? That's
Yeah.
where it's difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult, and I want to address, in April, maybe address that, which is maybe not satisfying to you.
It would be fine if we had no enemies.
Well, what in the world? Yeah.
And isn't that the kingdom?
Yeah, that is the kingdom. I will say this on this world, and one other thought. We need to be united. Unity is a good thing, but unity and uniformity are not the same thing. And the problem is we always want to have unity based on uniformity, and I think in this world, first of all, just having different perspectives. I mean, I'm awfully glad that we have a country music and jazz and classical music and world music and all this kind of stuff. That's just a lot of diverse things. But also recognizing I have my own flaws. It's actually very helpful to know that there's probably chances where I have to be held accountable. I have to be challenged by somebody who thinks differently to get me to where I am supposed to be in this world. And that's the other thoughts I have about that. I'll say this also as a historian, when I think about all these things, what do we do? And sometimes I'm like, oh, this world's just really messed up, isn't it? It's a broken world. And then there are times when I'm sort of amazed by human beings. And you know what? This is an example. I'm amazed by this. I'm amazed by great losers when you really stop to think of it. Given all this context and given how recent of a thing loyal opposition is and the human nature to the problem of power. These are very ambitious people who want power. These people who feel very, very strongly that their program is good. And to concede and say these things and peacefully transfer power, that's amazing. John McCain, Al Gore, and plenty of other people before that, and Republicans and Democrats, not only on the presidential level and the other. And I'll use one other example. I'm absolutely amazed that we somehow abolished slavery. I've mentioned that before. When you think of all the power and all the money people were making that and what human nature is like, and it's very, very complicated how that actually happened. But it did happen. And then that brings me back to there must be a God at work in the world, which we sometimes lose sight of. That there's grace that is greater than our human flaws and our human misperceptions. And the more we as individuals and the more we as a body can open ourselves up to God's grace, the more likely that powerful things can get established, that even people who are not open to grace will follow it because it's the thing you're supposed to do according to virtue, even if they're not doing it from virtue. I don't know exactly how virtuous Kamala Harris or John McCain or Al Gore. I have guesses. But I do know, and by the way, this shows this principle is still alive and well in our society, and I'm glad about that. And we can keep working to maintain this. Republican or Democrat, there are people who I lost the election, it'll be handed over. You disagree with me, we are going to have disagreements. We're going to have to compromise sometimes in our political processes. Those are amazing sort of things. So that's the hope that I give. But the ultimate hope, I think, is whatever this world faces and throws at us, Christ is more powerful than that. And that's what we head into Palm Sunday and Easter about. So let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, in this flawed and broken world, and we with our own flaws and brokenness, we pray that your grace would increase in us and that you would continue to build in us individually and as a body and as a society and in your church worldwide, that grace where we can love our neighbor, to do what is right, to seek justice, and to love you with all our heart and soul and mind. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.